Welcome to the Innovation Speaker Series in June. We are very happy to have with us Dr. Atif Ansar. He has had many different roles, and he will talk about them later also in his presentation. But I think one of his most important roles right now is that he is the chairperson of Foresight Works. And the title of this company, I think, is already very intriguing. They actually look at next generation software for mega projects. And he will take us now through a journey to explain his own story, being very innovative, using data to inform the planning and execution of mega projects. The topic is very relevant for us as an infrastructure bank. We love large-scale infrastructure projects. They are a lot better to disperse, probably to manage, than many small infrastructure projects. But Atif will challenge us today with his presentation. We have also with us here Andrew and Dave from the Pacific Department. They brought Dr. Atif actually to us and suggested that we have a presentation and invite him. So thank you very much, Andrew and Dave. And we'll come back later to Andrew and Dave when we go through the questions. And please drop your questions in the chat box or write them down so that we can have a very interactive conversation. If you have questions during the talk, please also drop them in the chat box, and we'll make sure that they get picked up by Atif. So now, Atif, over to you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Real pleasure to be here with you. And thank you, Andrew and Dave, for also inviting me. My name is Atif Ansar, as Suzanne mentioned, and I wear two hats. I'm a professor at Oxford University at Said Business School. So a very warm virtual welcome from University of Oxford. It's the best university in the world. Cambridge came in second, so well done to them. And my second hat is to be a co-founder and executive chairman of Foresight Works, which is a technology company. So my two passions professionally are mega projects and artificial intelligence and data. So today I'll be talking to you about how to harness data, which ADB has bucket loads of, and empower AI in order for you to deliver projects better and support your client governments as well in improving their overall execution of mega projects. Oxford, like in many faculties, and jokes aside about it being the best university in the world, so with, as I was saying, with Oxford, like in many faculties, is world number one in terms of number of publications or number of citations. That's certainly true for our faculty in mega projects. So I belong to a unit of about 8 professors at Said Business School, and this has been going for well over a decade now. And we've got 2 courses. So the MSc in Major Program Management, which I directed for nearly 5 years, as well as the UK Government's Major Projects Leadership Academy, the MPLA. That model, which is required, by the way, for all senior civil servants in the UK to come to, so 3-week course of 12 months at Oxford. That model has now been replicated by the governments of Hong Kong and Australia. The point in saying this is that Oxford has a great, particularly among top universities, a great specialism in this area. And many of the insights I'll share with you today borrow on this provenance, as well as work of my colleagues at the university. So what are major and mega projects? This is David Leonenthal looking at the Norris Dam at the time of the Tennessee Valley Authority dam build in the 1930s. And it's $1 billion plus investment even at that time, which was transformational for the American New Deal. So major mega projects are exactly that. They are transformational assets that have the potential to change the trajectory of countries and companies. But they're also complicated. So examples of them include anywhere from London Olympics to very large bridges, to dams, to airspace programs. I've just recently finished a paper about space missions of NASA versus SpaceX. Power plants, big science. Dams is something I'm very interested in, partly because I grew up in Pakistan and we have quite a bit of hydropower potential, but at the same time, they can also have quite a few complexities in terms of being delivered. And that's sort of my foray into this world of mega projects. A little bit about myself. prior to coming to Oxford, I started my career at the World Bank. So I'm quite familiar with the international financial institutions like the World Bank and Asian Development Bank. I had gone to Georgetown University in Washington, DC. So I was in the area and then got my first job in DC. And we started off with projects financing infrastructure in South Asia. So having grown up in Pakistan, I was fluent in Urdu, and there was an opportunity for me to work on a project in Pakistan. And the project was facing quite a few difficulties. So I started asking very awkward questions of my boss. And at that time, she didn't appreciate these questions, but later on, she came around to why that was necessary for me to ask those questions. And first awkward question was, do all World Bank projects have problems like this, or is our project unique? Do all World Bank projects run over budget and over time? Do all World Bank projects have issues dispersing? Do all World Bank projects have executing agencies that don't know what they're doing? So these awkward questions got me very blank stares from my boss at the time and not very encouraging answers. But 3 years later, I left the World Bank to come to Oxford to start a PhD to precisely answer those awkward questions as a scholar, with the intention to potentially go back to the World Bank, which was my original idea. But I got sidetracked by the world of academia once I got to Oxford. But asking those awkward questions became necessary to producing this data set. This is the world's largest data set of its kind on mega project outcomes, built with colleagues at Oxford. And that sort of is the basis for our courses as well. And what these data show are that cost overruns, time overruns, and benefit shortfalls are very typical of mega projects the world over, irrespective of the financing method. And it's not just a developing country problem, it's also a developed country problem. And that challenge is fairly pervasive across every asset class. So I'm highlighting rail sector over here, partly because for its sustainability credentials, it's a great asset class to invest in. At the same time, rail projects have 42% average cost overruns. 8 out of 10 rail projects like intercity rail lines or urban metro lines run over budget. They also have a 42% schedule overrun. So a 10-year project ends up being a 14-year project. But more worryingly, they have a 51% benefit shortfall. So half the riders downturn up. And finally, cost black swans are out of the ordinary overrun. So 3 times or more overrun in the building of the rail. Rail projects also take a very long time to build, so nearly 8 years. When I published one of my papers, it was actually on dams. My boss, who had not been very happy with my awkward questions, wrote me an email and said, "You did it." She put a word starting with F in the middle, but you did it. And she was very proud of the fact that those awkward questions led to this. So you can ask awkward questions, and asking those awkward questions leads to innovation. And I'll then connect this data set to the work I'm now doing with artificial intelligence, nearly over a 15-year journey that's taken. So let me give you a quick primer into what I'll call the challenges and the causes of mega projects. I'll give you a quick primer into the world of major mega projects, talking about their challenges, the causes of those challenges, and then finally I'll talk about cures in the form of artificial intelligence. So just as a quick thing, you're all familiar with what's known as the iron triangle of project management. And the iron triangle is you have to deliver a certain physical scope. You have to deliver it to a certain timeline. So if you're building a rail project, that could be, say, a 100-kilometer rail with 10 stations. That's your physical scope. The time might be, you build this in 8 years. And the cost is the budget you'll spend on it. So Crossrail, for example, was a £14.9 billion project in the UK. Crossrail is a very large rail project that just opened in London, now known as the Elizabeth Line, for those who might be following the news. Now, the interesting thing is the majority of the people are obsessed with scope. So that's basically the engineering deliverable. And a lot of organizations obsess with cost. So there's a huge amount of fiduciary controls and what money is spent, how is it spent. Every cent is accounted for. This double entry accounting system that the Jesuits invented nearly 500 years ago. And there's a huge amount of external audit of cost. Interestingly, organizations waste time all of the time. even though time is the ultimate finite resource. So as I go through it, one argument I'll make for you is the focusing heavily on time, or at least balancing a focus on time as much as we focus on scope and cost, will already help you improve outcomes of your projects. Time also, we think about time in terms of verbs rather than nouns. So it's it's a way of dealing with that. So now, moving on to some of the challenges of mega projects. This is our data set on global dam projects from around the world. By the way, quite a large number of these data come from the ADB, also the World Bank, as well as other sources like the Tennessee Valley Authority. East scatter plot is a dam project. On the x-axis is the year of the approval, so the year it achieved board approval, for example. So Turbela Dam, for instance, in Pakistan was approved in the 1960s, so it appears over here, even though it didn't finish until 1984. On the y-axis is the ratio of actual budget divided by estimated budget. So anything that's on 1 means it was on budget. Anything above 1 means it was over budget. So 2, anything on 2 means it was double the original budget. And anything below 1 means it was under budget. As you can see, there's hardly any dots on budget or below budget. There's some crazy dots like this dam in Yugoslavia during the war period that is 50 times over budget. And the line of best fit across all these years is at 2. So dams on average across time double their original budget. This turns out to be a pretty big problem. So it leads us to, among other conclusions, 2 conclusions that I want to tell you today. One is experience of mega projects is not the same thing as expertise. So often professionals are very proud of the fact that they've spent 30 years doing mega projects, which basically means they've done 3 mega projects. And they may have had cost overruns on all of those 3 things. And they tell me that I'm a very unfriendly guy, but the truth of the matter is, just because somebody's worked in the industry for 30 years does not mean that they have any control.
I love your point on experience is not the same as expertise, which is so relevant for lots of the things we are doing now in ADB. We are basically at the cutting edge or, frontier of understanding how to do business that is green and clean and aligned with the Paris Agreement. So I think your point is very well taken. Experience is not the same as expertise, and expertise evolves. But back to you again.
The second takeaway is projects seem not to learn from the past. So we do repetitive things in projects, but we don't get repetitive outcomes. And I'll connect this to what AI is good for. You can use AI and machines to help you get repetitive outcomes, learn from the past. Machines have one great advantage over human beings, which is that machines are emotionally impartial. Machines don't get involved emotionally into these projects. They also have an amazing memory because they don't forget anything once it's stored in the hard drive colloquially. Whereas human beings have selective memory and we get emotionally very involved in our projects, which I'll come to in a second when I talk about psychology. So you could really use machines to, as a result, balance those human cognitive biases, whilst also performing best where machines are not very good, like in dealing with new information, etc., where human judgment is really required. So what are the challenges that we've just covered are exactly that, where cost overruns, time overruns are endemic. What I'm showing here is cost overruns on the x-axis, ridership shortfall on the y-axis. Anything below 1 on the y-axis means fewer benefits than intended. Anything high on the x-axis mean that budgets overran. As we can see, that hardly anything falls on target. These are European rail projects that we're showing here, Western European, I should emphasize. So these are in developed countries with very high project management capabilities. And almost, great majority of them fall in the disaster zone. So what is the cause of these challenges? And the challenge is, just to summarize, the projects are over time, over budget, under benefits over and over again. Our life's work in working with partners like yourself is to help them bring on time, on budget, to benefits every time. So that's our vision statement because of Oxford and our partners like ADB. So how do we get to this vision? First, we have to understand the causes, and I'll race to the causes so we can get to the cures more quickly. The causes are threefold. One comes from psychology, the second from political science, and the third from physics. The psychological explanation is that human beings have cognitive biases. So here I'm showing you the Müller-Lyer illusion. Almost all of you have seen this optical illusion. And we can't help but see that the lower line is longer than the line above, even though from past experience we know that they are exactly the same length. The problem with this particular cognitive bias, or these puzzle, is that even if Müller-Lyer, who invented this illusion, was to see it today, he wouldn't help but see the lower line be longer. So just because you have knowledge of the illusion doesn't exempt you from the illusion. That's the nature of biases. Just because we have experienced this illusion before doesn't mean that we can now overcome it. Our brain just cannot do the job in these cases. And that's a long evolutionary history of how these biases emerged. And they have their uses as well. So the other issue with this is that even experts are not exempt from this. So, we are experts and lay people alike are subject to cognitive biases. A final point I want to make, and the most important point is, I could be tricking you today, and I could have intentionally made the lower line longer. The only way for you to know that I was not tricking you was to measure it with a foot ruler. There's really no other way of overcoming this illusion except for what Kahneman, a psychologist, calls slow thinking, which is to take a measuring rod and measure both lines and determine for yourself of whether or not this is genuinely an optical illusion or whether I am pulling wool over your eyes. This work, it goes by colloquially also with the idea of optimism bias, which Susan referred to in the chat. And what this shows is a little kitten looking at a mirror and seeing a lion with a fully grown mane and a big roar. And that's known as optimism bias. So human beings are optimistic about the time it takes to do simple things like the grocery run, or how long it might take us to finish our exam, also known as the student fallacy. The conclusion of this is that in mega projects, the biggest risk is you. It's not the external environment. It's the biggest risk is a person facing the external environment because they're underestimating the risk in the external environment. It's not like risk just emerges. It's because they underestimated that the risk was there to begin with. This work won, this is Professor Kahneman, and formerly at Princeton University, receiving the Nobel Prize from the King of Sweden. And he's a psychologist, but he surprisingly won the Nobel Prize in economics. And in 2011, he condensed all his life's learning into this book called Thinking Fast and Slow. So I highly recommend, if you have time this summer to read, to pick up this book, because it's full of a lot of wisdom that unpacks this idea further. An example of where optimism bias and particularly risk underestimation can become quite fatal is the Challenger disaster. And in the Challenger disaster, people knew from past data the chance of blowing up was 1 in 50. So one launch from every 50 launches blew up in midair. But as that number was reported upwards, it was cleansed and cleansed and cleansed until it was reported as 1 in 100,000. So partly that optimism that this would be all okay, and partly the organizational influence, it led to an underestimation of risk by nearly 2,000 times. Which leads me to the second cause, which comes from political science. And the cause is, this is the great, but perhaps slightly malicious writer called Machiavelli. And Machiavelli, when he wrote the book called The Prince, advised the princes of the time, and it's gender neutral, by the way, because many of the princes of his time were women leading Italian city-states. And he advises them in saying, look, if you want to get something done, you can't just tell the truth to the public. You have to oversell the benefits. You have to understate the costs. That's the only way it will work. And that we call the Machiavellian formula. So also known as strategic misrepresentation. Being academics, we have to put it in Latin, but strategic misrepresentation is Latin for lying. And what this means is in mega projects, you have to strategically underestimate costs strategically overestimate the benefits, underestimate negative environmental impacts, and overestimate wider economic benefits. And that's the only way you get board approval. And all of us who've been in the trade understand how this Machiavellian formula works. So I won't dwell on it too much. An example of that is the Sydney Opera House. So the Sydney Opera House had a 1,400% cost overrun. Kim Utzon, who's the son of Jon Utzon, the architect of Sydney Opera House, says, look, the budget really was totally politicized. There was really no rhyme or reason to it. So even though the actual cost overrun may have been 1,400%, the real cost overrun of actual thing was maybe about 100%. The rest was politics. So this is probably an extreme example of, and we know at the time that the mayor of Sydney had cancer. He really wanted to build something for his legacy. So he sort of just started the project with an extremely low-ball budget to get it going because he was afraid that it wouldn't get built in his lifetime. And he was in fact true, like he passed away during the construction. So this is where we saw in cognitive biases that where the brain cannot do the job, here the brain is in active gear and does too much of the job. A final reason comes from complexity. This is a visualization of a schedule of a nuclear power plant. Each dot, each blue dot or green and red dot is an activity that has to be performed in order for this plant to get built. All the links, like the green and the red links, are dependencies within these activities. So in order to, for example, build the walls, you must first stick the foundations, etc. This creates this very massive complexity, also known in mathematics as a directed acyclic graph. This is so complex that no human team, no matter their genius, can overcome this. And small delays in one part of the program, one part of the directed acyclic graph, percolate through this entire system. So you may have proverbially heard about the butterfly that causes a hurricane. And this actually led to a Nobel Prize, another Nobel Prize by P.W. Anderson. And he calls it the concept of broken symmetry. So an example is as follows. I often ask my master's students, how much time do you think it will take you to write a 100-word email, a 1,000-word essay, a 10,000-word master's dissertation, and a 100,000-word PhD dissertation? Now, the task size is growing in a linear manner, but the task complexity grows in a nonlinear manner. So a 10,000-word master's dissertation is not the same thing as 100 emails. There's two different things. You can write 100 emails easily, you probably do in a week, sometimes even in a day. No one can write a master's dissertation in a week. Similarly, for a PhD is not 1,000 emails. It's much more difficult than that. You could, at a stretch, write 1,000 emails in a week. But even geniuses at universities like Oxford cannot do it. So the basic thing is, as projects scale up in a linear way, their complexity scales up in a non-linear way. And human beings don't necessarily process that, and as a result, get stuck in the risks. This complexity exposes projects to two types of risks. So one are what's known as black swan risks. These are very improbable, but extremely high impact risks. So for example, the tsunami that hit the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan is an example of such a black swan event. Cumulative fragility, on the other hand, is the more common thing. Cumulative fragility is death by 1,000 cuts. It's basically little delays. The noise management plan not filed on time. The design approval is not achieved. The customer consent not achieved. These little cuts that seemingly cause a little delay, and your dashboards keep saying the project's on track, the project's on track, but in fact, a huge delay is accumulating and is not discovered until much later. So how do we cure this? And particularly, how do we use data? In fact, methods as well. So to Paolo's point, AI is not a panacea, but it's a way to enforce discipline, particularly around data, in order to deliver better outcomes. So first thing is, in order to use AI, or in fact, any process like Agile or Scrum, you need to be organizationally mature. So organizational immaturity is to go from one extreme to another. So like in the individual level, organization that pretends, oh, we have everything, we don't need anything. Oh, we have nothing. Oh, we can do this 100% with no issues. Or woe is us, we cannot do this at all. We've tried this before, it never worked. These are signs of organizational immaturity. So in order to innovate, you have to let go of these attitudes, which is to stay in the middle, and you probably have many strengths, and you probably have many weaknesses as an organization. And it's to form a realistic assessment of what you do have and what you don't have, what you can achieve and what's outside reach for the time being. So key is to forming that realistic view of the as is. And the first use of data, this is well before AI, is to help you form that view of the as is. So what does that view look like? I'll just quickly jump ahead. So imagine, because you're at the ADB, you've invested in many, many projects, you've got quite a bit of data. Imagine you were building 100 projects that were completely identical. Just go along with this for a second. And imagine all of them had an end-to-end duration of 24 months. So in order to then establish what is your true performance, one way to collect the data would be to simply create a register of those 100 identical projects and their estimated time, which is 24 months. The third column would be, how many months did we actually take to complete these identical projects? And what you might discover is that some of the projects came in early, many of them came in roughly on time within tolerance, and some were real headaches and got super delayed and caused a lot of organizational angst. So the underlying probability distribution, instead of looking like this flat gray line, would look like this red squiggly line. Some under time, many more or less on time, and some real hairballs that cause headaches and get people fired. The overall impact of that is that the project average time goes up from 24 months to 36 months. So first things first is simply develop this as is understanding of where do you stand. You have the data. You don't need external people for it. You already possess that data internally, partly because I have collected that World Bank ADB data. So I know that it's there. And you can look at your project completion reports and compare them against the recommendations of the president to the board at project investment decision to collect this sort of data. Once you have that, you can then try and figure out, how do we get rid of this red squiggly tail at the very end? So the first approach is simply to systematically identify particular activities that run late or over budget and try and cut the tail of the risk. That's the first job. And that's where sophisticated data science, colloquially also called AI, comes in very handy. Then, if you're really good and things are going really well, you can try and flip that Jensen asymmetry and try and achieve schedule compression or budget compression. And that's to actually reduce the overall time. So identify opportunities where you can do things a lot faster than you've been doing or a lot cheaper than you've been doing in the past. So it's a two-pronged approach. One is lower the schedule variance. And then once you've achieved more systematically lower outcomes, more repetitive outcomes, where the gap between your forecast and your reality is lower, then achieve lower point estimate. So i.e. compress schedule or compress budgets. That's what we do in essence. I was going to take you through a case study, but I think in interest of time, I'll just quickly give you a quick summary. What happened here was a developed country rail builder that had a massive time delay and a subsequent cost overrun on their project. The CEO was summoned to a press conference. The CEO didn't even know as of that morning that there was a cost overrun, so had no information about this. Got basic details of the project completely wrong in the press conference, and a week later got fired. The situation was that there was a 3-year delay on a 6-year project, so a 50% delay, and then a massive backlog, a lash of dissatisfaction among stakeholders, the government, regulators, the future users, etc. There's a massive public inquiry. What that discovered was that the reporting was extremely slow, so it was taking them a full month to process numbers from the month before. So basically, the executive team looking at the project was looking at data that was 2 months old. And as a result, the decisions were sort of in historic decisions rather than current decisions. What the executives wanted was more visibility faster. Second, the reports are mind-bogglingly complicated. The reports are 256 pages long, all printed, put in massive binders. You're smiling, so this is not unfamiliar to you. And people would just flip through them, see nothing, don't understand anything, just put them in bed. So what executives wanted was very simple reporting that could answer simple questions. Are we on track? Is the project going to meet its finish date? Who is performing well among the contractors? Which contractors need more support? Are our run rates sufficient, etc.? Finally, these delays were not unique in the project. They had experienced them before. So executives wanted ways of learning from that data to predict and prevent surprises. So, the key aspect of this is that the kind of work my team and I did in this was to ingest their data. We ingested nearly, I'll skip over all of this. We ingested nearly 1,361 major contracts, 20,000 Primavera files. And I'll be curious to see how you're doing your scheduling at ADB or your client governments. And that provided a huge amount of insight for them of how to keep their future mega projects on time. Which I'll skip over now, but there's some videos in this presentation which you can watch on your own as well. So I'll pause here with a 5-minute time overrun, so even experts are not exempt from cognitive biases, and turn over to Suzanne for Q&A. One thing to mention, Paolo, is you can use AI algorithms to power an agile Kanban style system. So what you're seeing here is a system we built with Crosstrail in the UK that took a lot of that data and created, so what the AI was powering was simply a reshuffling of their key priorities. So what should they be focusing on that day? And it helped them, help the human management maintain focus on the most important and urgent tasks. But the tasks were defined by the human beings themselves. I'll pause here and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Atif. I think a great story where you took us through innovation and understanding human behavior, innovation to actually speak truth to a problem, and innovation in using data to improve how these projects are managed. And I think the other innovation is, which is important for us, is to look at time of implementation as time as an important asset, because with delays in implementation, we also delay benefits to our beneficiaries. So try to summarize a bit of the points. So now we want to open for questions, and to warm us all up, I'll invite Andrew and Dave to ask the first question. So maybe Dave, if you want to go first, or Andrew. Oh, Andrew, I can see you already. You're the first one to come on screen.
Great.
And you also introduce us to Atif. Why don't you go ahead with the first question, and then I'll read in the chat box the other questions.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks so much. And Atif, thank you for a very, very informative presentation. I think that was interesting and raises a lot of questions. From our perspective in the field, what we often grapple with is project preparation. And so the question I would have after your presentation this evening is, how important do you think project preparation is for avoiding the pitfalls of mega projects? So have you seen any examples where proper preparation and surveying, so physical, environmental, social, has effectively countered the biases in large projects and laid the groundwork for more successful implementation? Thanks.
Absolutely, Andrew. So great questions. I think first thing is upfront planning. There's just no substitute for it. Roger and Miller, two academics at MIT, suggest that spending up to 33% of the capital budget on upfront planning, and sometimes up to 1/3 of the total time on upfront planning. The good news is, for an organization like the ADB that finances repeat projects, you have a huge amount of prior experience to learn from, both baseline data as well as built data. So I would get a hold of your key knowledge assets, which are, by the way, all available in your library, and we can assist. Like, this is something I'm very passionate about, and look at, what were the systematic ways in which environmental impact statements were built? What were systematic ways in which schedules were built? I personally think schedules are a place to go, and look at the variances. If you're working in jurisdictions that are more risky than others, just budget for more contingency. So it doesn't get you to specific, precise forecasts about the point estimate, but it gives you a good range. So if you're in really risky jurisdictions, basically budget a greater contingency. If you are in jurisdictions that are more mature, you can have a tighter range around that. But, harness your old data, both the baseline and the as-built. I think the final point I'll make here is there's a typical bias that if you're at the baseline planning of a new project to only look at baseline data from other past projects. That's a mistake. You have to look at the as-built data because there's quite a bit of variance as we've seen. Look at if there's an updated schedule, look at the updated schedule rather than the original plan, which may be best case.
Thank you.
Thank you, Atif. I know that one of our colleagues in the resident mission looked at data as it happened data and past data, and he was quite worried that ADB doesn't look much at this data, which would be quite useful if you want to do a differentiated approach, right? Because it depends on the country context, actually, how long certain projects would also take. And maybe, Dave, you have a lot of experience working in many difficult countries and challenging countries. Any thoughts from your side and your question for Atif?
Well, yeah, certainly differentiation is required, and to understand the specific constraints of a partner that you're working with in a specific country, and indeed the delivery of materials and supplies. And that's really the question I wanted to ask about tonight, that relates to optimism bias on cost and time. And I think it's particularly germane for what's going on these days with global commodity prices. So we have the engineers' estimates for projects, and these are an important element of the project procurement. But with the inflationary environment and rises in import prices, and the typical passage of time between project processing, contract award, and contractor mobilization, as you were talking about with up-to-date data on the Gantt charts and the like, these cost estimates, as well as maybe time duration and implementation estimates, are often an inaccurate guide of actual cost of delivery. And for a lot of our clients, particularly in our FCAS or our fragile states or our small development states, there's not a lot of data readily available. So in your experience, what can governments do to avoid the pitfalls of being overly optimistic in the estimates of costs and indeed implementation time? Thank you.
Yeah, very good question, Dave. So I think particularly in fragile state contexts or where supply chains are less mature, it's very hard to estimate costs. So I completely agree with you. And I think the data availability may be an issue as well. So that's where I would first of all advise to focus heavily on schedule. Time, unlike money, is both finite as well as fungible. So the time it took to build the pyramids is relatable without you having to use an inflation index to time it would take to build a like-for-like asset today. Whereas cost changes, based on location you're in year to year, it's a much more of a flimsy concept and can become really difficult to pin down. So my suggestion would be to work in time and to sort of work out a basic cost of time. Time is money, and you can work out a very approximate sense of how much does a unit of time cost per project type in a place. And again, we could talk about this more offline. And so I would try and get a hold of schedules of comparable assets. If you're building a road project in a fragile state, I would try and get a hold of past schedules of such a road project. And that schedule will contain an interesting signature of the bills of quantities. It will contain a signature of the delays in consenting, in labor and land acquisition material. You'll be amazed by how much of it's like a fossil of many of the stuff that happens to these projects. And I'll try and get a hold of at least 5 projects. So by the way, one of the funny things that we've learned over time with artificial intelligence is AI is usually built on big data, but once you've got a good model up and running, it doesn't need a huge amount of new data to update itself. It doesn't change the overall human relevance of the model. So even 5 schedules from past projects is enough for you to get actionable insight. It may not be perfect, but it's enough for you to improve the decision quality, which is what you're seeking in such an environment. After schedule, I'd then go to bills of quantities, and I'd almost not worry about prices at all, because it's almost a thankless task trying to predict prices, particularly in today's environment where inflation's gone totally nuts. So I'll focus on simply volumetrics of how much gravel do I need, how much concrete do I need, how many labor hours do I need, many kilometers of land do I need. So sort of really getting a good handle of the basic volumetrics of time and quantities would be my suggestion to tailor your data collection on.
Thank you. Atif, I think this is interesting, because that's probably where ADB's critical knowledge and strength is, because we have schedules from working in many of our member countries for the last 50 years. So that's something to look at, and then bring in probably new expertise, how to bring in new technology to deliver faster. So now going to the next question, I will use the last one first, because it's a very sharp question, and I think gets to the point easily, and that is, what were the major root causes of cost time overrun in your analysis, and how is your approach, how your approach would solve those risks in advance or real time?
Yeah, so great questions. I think the root causes are really timeless, and which are the 3 root causes I've given you. So it's the physics of the project, how much complexity do you have? It's the politics of the project, how much lying or not is going on, and it's the psychology of the project. So are people optimistic, or are they taking active measures to counter their optimism? And those are sort of at the very broad level, the root causes that explain all cost overruns and time overruns where they occur. So they're sort of theoretical propositions that are fairly stable, and they're stable across time. So, we could collect data on Roman road projects, for example, and they had cost and time overruns, or Roman aqueducts, and, similar issues crop up there. At a more practical level, though, how do you counter optimism bias? So how do you counter strategic misrepresentation or complexity? So the antidotes come naturally from the causes. So first of all, with optimism bias, you need a measuring rod. So that's where data comes in play. And that's the idea that I've been mentioning, known in the literature as reference class forecasting, which is to collect past data, both as built and baseline, and compare it against each other. And as ADB, you have that data in droves. So don't let anybody tell you that it doesn't exist. It's there. And that's point number 1, is to systematically look at your past actual outcomes and their past plans. On strategic misrepresentation, that's incentive alignment. So that's your contracting strategy. That's the way you set up the governance. It's having multiple lines of defense against risk, etc. So a lot of that goes into the world of governance and risk management and process, which ADB is very strong on. So actually, you have the expertise in-house to be able to work with those incentive structures, and there's a lot of innovation, in contracting strategy, etc. there. By the way, I also think in terms of the way ADB largely works with your client governments, there isn't anything fundamentally wrong with those governance. It's not an area that I would worry about the most. So I would worry about optimism bias and complexity. As ADB, I think client governments have more of an issue around governance than ADB. On complexity, take measures to reverse complexity. To the degree you can, learn from past data in order to decouple things from each other. So the more interdependencies you have, the more interfaces you have, the risk expands exponentially. So I would use that front-end planning phase that Andrew talked about to strategically decouple things from each other, to make them less interdependent upon each other, reduce the number of interfaces to the degree you can. Here again, data is your friend. So knowing what are the typical interfaces where risks occur, or the typical interdependencies where things get stuck, I would focus on first discover those, find them empirically in your past data, and then work very hard to zap those interdependencies prior to getting the project started. So for example, design is a big challenge in mega projects. People spend way more on design than way more time on design than they realize. And if you haven't got design, AKA engineering deliverables, you can't build. And actually, so I would try and spend much more time on design. So if in your Primavera schedule, design is one 400-day long activity, I would really explore that very thoroughly and make sure you've got a really good sense of what's happening on every day of people doing the drawings, and chase up on the drawings, because each missed drawing is increasing that risk exponentially. And you don't necessarily know that as the lending officer.
So thank you, Atif. There's one good question here also, a kind of a simple suggestion and a good question. That's from SY here. If the statistics show that average ADB project cost overrun is double the original cost estimate, and the average project time overrun is 1.5 times longer than expected, why don't we just put 100% more to the original cost estimate and 50% more of time? So why don't we just automatically try to balance and counteract on these biases?
So I think the portfolio owner writing the checks or giving the time should do exactly that. But that can't be done at the project level. So as a portfolio, if you're responsible for the treasury of the ADB, and you're trying to estimate an actuarial model of how long it will take for the money to come back, I would certainly take an actuarial approach like what you identified. But if you're a project manager, you have to take a little bit more of an operational approach, partly because that range is too wide. So some projects are 20% over budget, some projects are 120% over budget. Where will you land? You know, people want to have a slightly tighter confidence around their exit cost and their exit time. So that's point number one. As a project manager, you want a tighter estimate. And second, there are technical steps you can take to reduce that uncertainty. So that confidence interval statistically is very wide, but you can see that there are some real bad eggs in that project, which were lacking basic hygiene. And you can reverse that basic hygiene problem of those projects and it reduced that uncertainty by a lot, and it's worth buying that insurance by investing in
the data helps us also to manage throughout the process, right? Because we are now more aware of the biases and we have better data, we can actually mitigate them, which brings me to this question from Hang, who's saying project progress monitoring should also start before approval and capture preparatory task in real time. That's a question. Should it start, right? Should capture.
Absolutely.
Yes.
What you see behind me is my blackboard, and it's got a bunch of inscrutable equations on it. But what it is on the very top line, if you see the line, is a project development life cycle. And it really begins from the project start, the first mention of a project. And if it's a sizable project, you really ought to be tracking the front end phase as well. Now, I'm all for front end planning, but the paradox in this is Professor Eisenhardt at Stanford did this research, and she found that in high performance organizations, they collect a huge amount of information in the upfront phase, but they also collect it extremely quickly. So both, in her words, the information intensity and the information velocity is very high. So you can't drag that process on forever. So do collect a huge amount of information, but collect it extremely quickly. And for that, you need good data governance. So you need it to be readily available.
And understand which data governance. So there's also a question here that as, do you think it might be possible to develop a real-time project progress monitoring platform?
Yeah, that's my startup. So come talk to me.
And I think Anne had a question. Anne had a question is asking, how much training would project staff and managers need to effectively independently work with this digital tool, the platform that you are offering, or others are offering?
Yeah, I think the training is one has to invest in it substantially, and it's not just in the digital tools. The training is in project leadership, right? So in almost every organizations we work with, we pair that with. So, for example, we work with a very large electric utility in Asia, and they are investing in this digital platform, but they're making an even larger investment in the people, in training the people with Oxford faculty. And the point is that data is not a panacea. It's not a magic bullet that's just going to suddenly resolve everything. There's a lot more to it. So the training involves overall project leadership, of which data is a core, but not the only part of that solution.
Yeah, very good point. And I come back with another question, but I see that Trevor raised his hand here. Trevor, you want to come in with your question?
I just wanted to ask, Atif, about your startup. And I just wanted to appreciate that you are from academia. And at ADB, we really are in that kind of multilateral space. I was wondering, are your ambitions for the startup one that are commercial, or are you looking to enable, I guess, an approach for the likes of developing member countries? Because part of the challenge is that the developing member countries that we have struggle in many ways. And your point that, I mean, Andrew kicked it off, which is that the project preparation element to us is so huge and important. So I just wanted to know, are you aiming for a public good in some regard that assists this public purse that is the predominant financier of infrastructure? Or is it where you'd like to be a supplier or a provider of solutions that is purchased by the public sector?
Yeah, great question, Trevor. So like many public goods, it's a non-private, it is a public good, but what we're building is most certainly a public good. And one of the great advantages of that is that there's some people, particularly commercial people, who are paying us enough where we can offer this service very cheaply to other people. So, as I mentioned, I grew up in Pakistan. So we, in fact, offering quite a bit of this to a particular unit in Pakistan for free for the time being. We know they can't afford it. And we're sufficiently early stage at the moment, where it behooves us to, give quite a bit of it away, or to work with people in a way that respects the public good nature of it. So yeah, no, very much the case. And I think in some instances, particularly in developing countries where client governments just haven't got the financial capacity, I think they're paying too much for some of their technology, at the commercial level. So having worked in the development world, very much support the idea of making tools like this available to them as a way for them to just open their minds about what their reality looks like.
So it's basically, Trevor?
It's not a perfect end-to-end, but Atif, I would love to take you up on that offer. ADB and a number of MDBs have built a platform for software for project preparation. We would love to learn more about your thoughts as a true expert and not just experienced person in this space. And so it would be really great if we could, under the premise of that public good for those developing countries, exchange notes, because our platform is now beginning to take a lot more momentum, and it would be really great for us to show. For example, just a couple of weeks ago in Uzbekistan, they passed regulation that this platform must be used for certain projects going forward in order for those project preparation activities to be properly structured. A big issue we have is on unstructured data, where everybody holds up a feasibility study, but it's printed in a PDF, and therefore it is unmanipulatable, unable to inform decision-making. And so structured data is the key for us to be able to inform the expertise that is needed for decision-making. But Atif, I would like to just take you up on that. I really appreciate your candor. So thanks very much for this presentation and your answer.
Great.
Thanks.
So we already made a connection. That's the whole goal of this innovation series, to connect innovators from outside with our colleagues here. So Trevor will link you up. I think great point here. We need structured, but also unstructured data. Unstructured data tells us often something about behavior, what people think, and the culture. And maybe one point here is we really have to think about our RRPs, our recommendations to the president, which are always very positive and optimistic, and maybe bring in more data. And also make sure that these are not just stagnant PDF files, and then maybe look more at the project completion reports. Maybe that's something we should look at in our transformation of the organization. Andrew, any thoughts you have there, being a team leader, project officer? Any additional reflections or questions you have for Atif?
I'm going to ask a terrible question of Atif, and apologies in advance. So I think a lot of us are picking up on this idea of our projects being client-led, and our clients having quite serious capacity, financial and other constraints. And the world is moving in this technology direction. And we need to involve our clients in that transition. But that transition will also be very disruptive. And so as we work with our clients to integrate automation into financial management, robotics in construction, what do you see as sort of the most socially disruptive technological advance in the next 10 or 20 years? Thanks.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you, Andrew. You know, so the word disruptive is often viewed as in a way as if it causes an upheaval of some sort. So something was in place and it somehow displaces it. I think by and large, I don't think in project management, particularly in developing country context, there's something, the need is so large. You know, we are 7 billion people and population is growing. There's a massive shift towards carbon neutral assets. Just the building need is so intense that anything that improves productivity is helping. So I think productivity enhancing technologies are modularity, automation of the kind that I've spoken about, digital automation of the data, but also robotic automation that you refer to. You know, so it's kind of the three angles of it: digitalization, automation, and modularization. So those are three co-joined trends. I think modularity and a lot of the robotics will happen at the modular factory rather than like cars are built, rather necessarily at the site. You know, these trends are happening, and what that will mean is that the number of jobs that are available in infrastructure will be lower than people estimate, but the services that appear for public will happen much faster and much quicker. So if there's something disruptive about these technologies, it's that the number of job creation would not be in line with the spend. It will be much lower, and that, you know, but on the other hand, the prosperity will be much greater. So there'll be much greater need for software engineers and much lower need for bricklayers. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And maybe one last question for you, and that is, this transformation requires a lot of learning, right, from ourselves and from everyone involved, and also in all kinds of countries. How can we innovate and accelerate this learning to create more data, use more data, be aware of the biases, and so on?
So yeah, I'll give a very odd recommendation. Watch a lot of YouTube videos. Basically, everything that there is to learn out there is already available. It's available. It's for free. So
it's about curating the right kind of learning program for ourselves and for the counterpart. Okay.
And motivating yourself. At the end of the day, like you're the learner. So it's you as the individual.
Thank you very much, Atif. I can see we had many different questions. If your questions haven't been answered, please email them to us and we'll make sure Atif gets back to you. Great summary. I think you touched really on all points. It was fantastic that you showed that the technology is not the solution. That's not the innovation. It's actually about human behavior. How do we understand that? How do we bring in technology to improve how we make decisions? How do we balance out our own, weaknesses as humans, our subjectivity, and only all of that together will be the secret sauce to address the huge complexities that we are currently facing. And Atif, we are now inviting you as friends of the Innovation Hub. We'll stay in touch with you and we'll connect you with all relevant colleagues here who have asked questions and want to be in touch. So thank you very much for making time for us. And thank you so much, Andrew and Dave, for bringing Atif to ADB. Really fantastic. I know we want to have more conversations, so maybe there's another opportunity for that.
Look forward to it. I'll fix my Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Susan. Bye, Andrew. Bye, Dave. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Have a great afternoon.
You too. Thank you.